So our next presentation is one I think that you will really personally enjoy, and it's certainly very, very pertinent given the series of world events today. We have the benefit of a discussion today with a distinguished faculty member on a hot topic that all of you know. And I'm going to ask Amy Eichhorst to introduce our guest.
We're taking the long route around here. Well, I heard this morning on the Today Show, thank you Today Show, that today is the 100th day since Russia invaded Ukraine. And we really are excited to have with us a real expert in this area, Shibley Telhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development, a distinguished scholar and teacher here at Maryland, and the director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. And actually, I just found out this week that he's a member of the Brookings Working Group on Russia and Ukraine, where he meets with the country's experts on these topics. So that's very exciting for us. Before coming to Maryland, he worked at a host of prestigious universities. I won't mention them all, but University of California, Berkeley, where he also received his doctorate in political science. He's been active in the foreign policy arena. Every president from George H.W. Bush through Barack Obama has counted on his counsel. He's also the author and editor of numerous books. So we're just gonna have a little dialogue today about this topic. And really, Jeff Williams mentioned this over lunch, but we're really excited to continue with this board, but also with our alumni to really tap into the incredible research and the work being done by our faculty here. So thank you for being with us. And I guess the first question I'll pitch your way is a real easy one, just a little bit of on the 100th day, a little brief overview of sort of the current state of affairs with the war.
Well, first, thank you for hosting me, and thank you all for what you do for all of us, for the university. And Matt, thank you for joining us. Welcome. I happen to be on the search committee that brought you on, so I saw you virtually. I'm glad to see you in person and looking forward to working with you. You should also know that I was on the search committee that brought Brodie Remington originally to campus. We didn't do too badly, and I think we had a very strong set of people, as you know, but you really stood out as an extraordinary person, and we're really glad to have you. So, and let me also say thank you to Brodie for all that you've done over the years. You and I have worked together from the very beginning. I really appreciate all that you have done for our institution. Thank you again. I mean, this is really good. Thanks. Thank you. So, with regard, let me just start with the Ukraine issue. I think that, if those of us who follow foreign policy very closely and who are even close to the administration and know what they're up to, I have to say that I was personally surprised that Russia invaded Ukraine. And even though I knew that the administration was warning that Russia will be invading Ukraine, a lot of people were criticizing the administration for saying, wait, maybe even Zelensky, if you recall, said, no, don't sound alarmist in saying they're going to do it. And obviously, that ended up being one of the assets of the Biden administration, the fact that they warned everyone. But the reason why everybody was suspicious, it seemed crazy, because it seemed that Russia couldn't really win this one. And even if they had succeeded militarily, as most people expected they would do, they were going to pay a political price, and then they're going to struggle. It's going to become their Afghanistan anyway. That's what everybody expected even then. And now it looks like they're even in worse shape than that. Because I think most people, including the administration, did not really expect the Ukrainians to fight like they did. And honestly, very few people expected the kind of unity that NATO brought to bear on this one. I mean, a lot of people had NATO for dead. And people were questioning whether it should, just a couple of years ago with our former president. And now NATO looks like it hasn't been stronger than it is today in decades. And now it's obviously with Sweden and Finland asking to join NATO. I happened to be on a panel last week with the deputy chief of mission of the Swedish embassy in Washington. I was moderating another panel, and she said that Sweden was absolutely surprised by how unified NATO acted. And between that and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which they had not anticipated, just like everybody else said, they would be crazy to do it, but they did it. It drove them to reverse policy that have had for decades of not joining NATO and to ask to join NATO. So bottom line is Russia, of course, is failing. It is failing maybe even more than most people thought it would fail, even though people knew that they couldn't succeed, politically. They're much weaker today than they were, and they've lost thousands of troops. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that anybody else won, because Ukraine is obviously paying the heaviest price in casualties and devastation. In Russia controls possibly up to 20% of the country. They're losing, according to the Ukrainians, something like 100 soldiers a day. And there is no ending that one can anticipate for either one in any foreseeable future. So this looks like it could be, you said it's 100 days, it could be 200, 300, 400, 500 days. We don't know when it's going to end. And conceptually, it's very hard to anticipate an outcome that could be a win for either one. So I think that's why the United States and NATO has been clear in first helping the Ukrainians, because they're the ones who have to fight, and they're the ones who are going to have to make a decision when they don't want to fight. It's not America's fight. It's America's support role for Ukraine. But the Russians ultimately are going to have to decide at what point do they quit. And I think at this point, it's totally unclear and fluid.
Well, I realize that it's really hard to predict, but just know that my last question is going to be asking you about your prediction for really how this will play out. But in the meantime, I want to dive into, I know in March and then just recently, I think in the last couple of weeks, you conducted a poll and reported on it, I think, at the Brookings Institute last week about American sentiment. And I'm interested to hear, some of the key findings, and also were there changes between when we first, some of the first days of the war and now this recent poll, and how the Americans are feeling.
Yeah, so we have, at the University of Maryland, we have the critical issues poll, which I direct. And so we do multiple polls on lots of issues, foreign policy and domestic issues. And we did two so far on Ukraine specifically, one the end of March and one just a couple of weeks ago that we released. We're going to do another one the end of this month, so we want to keep tracking it. But it's very fascinating to look at American public opinion. These are American public opinion polls, nationally representative polls, very large samples. In this case, the last one was over 2,000. And so there are some findings that are striking. Number one, Americans remain supportive of Ukrainians by and large, and are prepared to pay a price on some dimensions. For example, majority still say they're prepared to pay a price on in increased energy costs. They're prepared to pay a price in higher inflation, but they're not prepared to send troops. They're not prepared to pay in American lives, and they remain divided on a no-fly zone, imposing a no-fly zone. However, there is a big difference between the end of March and now. There are signs of fatigue in American public opinion. So while Americans are still supportive of paying some price, they're a lot less supportive today than they were 5 weeks ago. So there is a decline in the degree of support. The public is already getting tired, particularly on inflation. And number two, while initially that support was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats all supported, and up to a point, it remains somewhat partisan. It is somewhat bipartisan. Today, it's increasingly growing partisan, with big difference between Republican support and Democrat support on these issues. And to give you a flavor of this partisanship, one of the questions, even in the first poll, the end of March, 5 weeks into the war, we asked an open-ended question that had nothing to do with Ukraine. I asked that almost every poll just to get a sense, whom among world leaders do you admire most? And we just have them write the name down. And so this is 5 weeks after Putin initiated the war. And so an overwhelming majority of Democrats say Putin, of course. And Trump, which, as you know, Democrats, well, I at least don't like, and that's an understatement, but was second to Putin by far on this list. Among Republicans, number one most disliked was Biden, and Putin was a distant second to Biden. It should tell you something about the partisanship. In this poll, we did something interesting as well in terms of experimenting. So, for example, we divided the sample into two subsamples. So when we asked them, do you support the following steps that the U.S. has done, like unifying NATO, sharing intelligence, and so forth, instead of saying U.S., you think, for one group we said the Biden administration, for the other group we just said the U.S. And you can see, even though we're talking about all the same steps, when we mention Biden, Republican support drops completely. And when you say the U.S., Republican support increases. So we are still a very partisan country, even on Ukraine. If anybody had hoped that Ukraine was going to, overtake the partisanship, that hasn't happened. January 6th didn't do it. And obviously, Ukraine is not succeeding at bridging that gap.
Interesting, yeah. And I mean, fascinating information you gain through polling of the Americans. I know that you can't poll the Russians, but just based on what you know and your expertise, do you think, it's so public with us, Russian generals, resigning, and, there's mass graves and all these horrible things happening. I guess my first question is, are the Russians seeing that? The second question is, what is the Russian level of support, do you think, for being in Ukraine and for Putin generally?
Yeah, I mean, this obviously is, every week I'm meeting with this group at Brookings with some of the country's top experts on Russia and Putin. And that's a question that is constantly being observed and talked about every single week to see, where is the Russian public? I will just mention two observations. Number one, obviously you're right, first, that it's mostly state control information, and obviously therefore the public doesn't get the right picture. Of course they feel the pain, particularly when there are a lot of people who died, and some of the news is leaking out, and some generals have been outspoken even on state TV. But let's keep in mind that it's not just information. This is all about identity politics. Just like it's nationalism. It doesn't matter whether you pay a price or, let's look in our own country. We're a free country. We have free media. We have among the freest media in the world. And look at the divide between Republicans and Democrats, or Trumpists and non-Trumpists. With all the available information, how we don't even believe we disagree on what's true. We disagree in facts. We make decisions mostly based on our loyalties and and it's not about cost, because sometimes you're shocked to hear that people who are paying a price, let's say for COVID, or people who are paying price for gun shootings, or people who are taking positions that go seemingly against their own interest, because it's about identity politics. Putin is still popular in Russia. I mean, let's not delude ourselves. And yes, for example, It might get harder because the heavier price they pay, the more the public will feel it. And sanctions will have an impact, and they have had an impact, and they have weakened Russia. So I can't say that they have no impact. Russia can't today invade Finland. You know, that's, for example, right? I mean, that's a consequence, a weaker country, and Putin is weaker, but it doesn't mean that he loses control in his own country. We've seen this before. We've seen it, decades of sanctions against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The US had to launch a war in 2003 that was devastating and failed to dislodge him because the Iraqi people did not dislodge him. And I would even go one step further than that. I would say that, of course, there will be fatigue in Russia. Like, we're feeling even minor fatigue, in comparison. There will be fatigue in Russia, economic fatigue. But here's the thing. Fatigue in democracies is much more politically consequential than fatigue in autocracies. Because the autocrats can absorb the fatigue and still go on. And our public puts pressure on the politicians, and politicians start paying a cost in a democracy. So even minor fatigue here could be politically more consequential than major fatigue in Russia. So that's a sobering reality, that we can't expect that Putin will fall. Of course he could, but that's not something you can plan on. But the good news is Russia is weaker, so it can do less harm in global affairs.
Well, you talked a little bit about sanctions and weakening that sentiment. I mean, there's been a lot of publicity, and I don't know how often or how well we're really going after the oligarchs, stealing their yachts, or not stealing, I'm sorry, taking their yachts and trying to really affect them. Is that working? Is there anything else beyond that? I mean, are there kind of two questions? Is going after oligarchs really going to be changing the sentiment because those are the people that are, surrounding Putin more than others? And then I guess the other question is, are there sanctions that could be tougher, that are non-military, that will work, that will really, continue to weaken that sentiment?
Well, first with the oligarchs, I mean, it's symbolic. I mean, let's be honest.
Okay.
These guys don't have any influence with Putin. They're dependent on him. I mean, their wealth comes from the state. He's not going to listen to them, and some may leave him, but they leave him, and they pay a price. So I think it's symbolic. It's important in that sense. Symbolism matters, and it also, highlights the corruption, because we do know. The whole emergence of the oligarchs happened to come out of that Russian, political leadership corruption. So it does that. Now, are there other sanctions? Obviously, ultimately, the sanctions that will be most effective will be oil and gas, right? Because, frankly, Russia is no longer a superpower. I mean, it's a major power. It has nuclear weapons, but it's not a major player. By the way, their military budget, just to put it in perspective, is less than 10% of our military budget. It's more on par with the military budget of Saudi Arabia, just slightly higher than that of Saudi Arabia. So it isn't. It's a powerful country, but it's not a major power. And economically, it hasn't done exceptionally well, except in the production and sale of energy and oil. And that has been obviously a double-edged sword, because if you boycott the oil from Russia, you're paying a price for the oil market, as we see our own president, Biden, is finding he has to go to Saudi Arabia to make up with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia that he called the pariah, because now he needs Saudi oil to make up for the shortages in the market, and that wouldn't be enough in and of itself in any case. Oil is even bigger, because the Europeans are much more dependent on oil, and oil is, gas, much more dependent on gas, on Russian gas, and gas is a little bit harder to replace. There are places like Qatar that produce a lot of gas, and they've been willing, but that takes time to replace. So that could have an impact for sure, much more. I can't imagine, any other steps beyond that, honestly.
Okay, that's
And
sobering.
Especially, by the way, that we have to keep something in mind that while the U.S. has succeeded brilliantly, I would say, more than anybody expected, to unify NATO and get Western support beyond NATO, like Japan, let's say, to get that kind of support for the effort. Nonetheless, that's not true about much of the world. I mean, we live in a bubble. I mean, you go into places like India or places like the Middle East, including Israel, by the way, or Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab, both Israelis and Arabs. They're not unified on Ukraine, and they want to deal with Putin. And some are more angry with the U.S. In fact, in our polling in the Middle East among scholars here about the Middle East, they say the biggest winner is China, not the U.S., because people don't want to reward the U.S. for Russia's mistakes. And so we're still having a problem getting support, even beyond China, which is obviously a big issue, and China is still going to more or less protect its relationship with Russia because they see it as strategic, even if they don't want to undermine their business interests with the West.
So interesting. I have so many more questions, but I do, before I ask a couple closing questions, does anyone have a burning question? Jazz? You want to grab the mic for Jazz? There you go.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much. It's great to see you, Professor. So something at the beginning you said just kind of stayed in my mind. So obviously Putin doesn't bear the same political costs as, public officials here would. And given that, do you think to some degree at this point for him it's just a waiting game until the world starts to look at other interior problems? The other thing I thought about, which you didn't mention on, is that the countries within NATO, Germany namely, and a few others are now starting to up their defense budgets, which I think in the news was kind of celebrated a little bit. Are you a bit concerned at all about that? So if you can respond to both of those, that'd be very appreciated.
Yeah, I think, let me take it backward with the second one. Let's keep our eye on the ball, so to speak. Obviously, Russia is the aggressor here. And all of this crisis is the creation of Russia. I mean, there's no question about that. And Putin specifically making that decision, I think that whatever the reaction is, some of which may not be a positive development, militarization of Europe or people worrying and increasing military budgets in various places that have their own kind of consequence. I think that's that's unfortunate, and we have to be mindful of it. I'm of the opinion that war really never pays. I mean, you look at all of the wars that we've been in, we don't achieve their objectives, and it's almost always lose-lose. Some people lose more than win. But here, at this particular point, I think the vision is that Russia can't be allowed to emerge stronger. Obviously, Russia is going to be Russia. This is a major country. It's not going to disappear. And Putin may not lose power, as I said. But the idea here is that in relative terms, it'll emerge weaker and will not be able to bully others and perhaps be reluctant to do it. I think there is a consensus about that among our political elites, whether Republican or Democrats, perhaps not Trumpist. I think traditional Republicans agree on that. Trump has been a kind of an aberration with American history on this, particularly his relationship with Putin and attitude toward Russia. I'm fearful, as my polls are indicating, that we are seeing that even on Ukraine, people are beginning to play partisan politics. Now, whether or not other issues are going to overtake Ukraine, like our own, let's face it, the biggest threat to democracy today is not Russia for us, it is us. It is us. So we have to take care of our own house right now. And the rest of the world sees the biggest threat to democracy in America to be internal, not external. And we see, the sort of things that are on the public's mind. Foreign policy is rarely, if ever, a top priority for the public unless American troops are fighting and are getting killed. Ukraine is a big story, and it's now become a media story, and people see the devastation. And because it's Europe, they probably have a kind of more identification with it. But honestly, more people are going to be focused on abortion. The more people are going to be focused on gun issues. And those are going to be the ones that are going to drive politicians and elections, not Ukraine. And that's a reality.
I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. In your polling, was there support for, and I'm assuming there's some partisan differences here, but was there support for the U.S. taking direct military action? No,
absolutely not. In fact, one of the things that were surprising to me is that very early on, the overwhelming majority, like 90% of the public, was worried about any direct confrontation with Russia. They didn't want to do anything with that. So they want to support Ukraine, but they don't want to send troops. They don't want to get into a fight with Russia. That's why in the first poll that we did, I was very surprised that despite this overwhelming opposition to confrontation with Russia, we still had a slight majority, like 53%, who said they supported a no-fly zone. Well, wait a second. No-fly zone means you're going into direct conflict with Russia. You can't avoid it. How is this possible? Well, we did an experiment in this poll. So we divided the sample into two subsamples. We asked, in one sample, we introduced the information. We said, NATO and US officials say that imposing a no-fly zone means the risk of direct conflict with Russia. Do you support a no-fly zone or don't you? We only got 39% say they support. With the other sample, we said we didn't have the introduction. Do you support a no-fly zone or do you oppose a no-fly zone? We had 55% say they support a no-fly zone. So you could see the public has a little bit of a disconnect. They're really worried about the confrontation, but they also want to help Ukraine, and they get caught. And it depends how much information they have when they express their opinions.
Interesting. Looking for hands. I'm going to close out then with the question where what I hinted at. It's hard to predict, but I guess the first part of the question is, what is Putin's endgame? Does he want the whole country? Does he want the coastline? Does he want the regions that are loyal to him back? And if that's it, what is he after? And what do you see the endgame being here?
Yeah, and I think this is, of course, an area where a lot of people who follow Putin have different opinions. And this shows in our own group, in the weekly group where we're having all these experts who discuss this. I think what you find is the majority of Russia and Putin experts, including my colleague and former co-author Fiona Hill, who believe that it really isn't about NATO, because obviously NATO is an issue that Putin raised before.
Yeah.
And Russians worry about NATO, and that's true of all Russians, not just Putin. But he used that more of an excuse. He made himself clear. He said, I don't think Ukraine should exist as a state. Ukraine is not a nation. He made it very clear. So his ambition was to bring back Ukraine into, maybe not revive the former Soviet Union. I think even Putin knows that's not only not possible, but not even desirable from his point of view, but maybe a Slavic, Russia, a greater Russia kind of empire. And I think you have a lot of people who think that's the case. Now, of course, he's had to alter his plans. He probably expected Kyiv to fall very quickly. It didn't. Now he's focused on Donbass. But even if a, kind of a ceasefire, an agreement is reached, it doesn't mean he's going to end his ambition for the rest, because he knows that our attention span is going to be limited. He's next door, he's got locals who support him, and he's going to wait for another opportunity. So that's the thing that the U.S. has to deal with in terms of strategically. The U.S. can't possibly accept the idea that he can annex territory that could be recognized. The Ukrainians will not accept it. It might be more a ceasefire agreement where you just accept the status quo without accepting their sovereignty over it. But it's not clear. Honestly, it's not clear, because I think in the end it's going to depend on the performance on the ground. If he is able to gain territorial and continue to gain territorial control, he may not stop. If Ukrainians push him back and he starts paying a price and stay in place, that's where the negotiation is. So right now, I think each side is trying to get themselves in the best negotiating position for at least an interim outcome to end the fighting, but there's no end in sight to this.
So not a quick ending here?
No,
okay.
Not a quick ending.
Unfortunately, we have to stop there, but I really appreciate you coming with us today. You're such a resource for the university. I think we'll be sure to send out the poll information in our follow-up email to the Board of Governors, because I think there's so much more there about public opinion. But Professor Telhami, thank you so much, and just a small token of our appreciation for you, and we thank you so much for joining us today.